Now with our next note values I'd like to discuss would be eighth notes to sixteenths. Now to me this is really foundational. I use a lot of these. It's like, what's the most common part of a sandwich? It's the bread. Maybe not to you low carb people, but generally speaking. So for me, this eighths to sixteenths is a lot of the bread and butter of what I like to use, because it's so easy to make the transitions. And if you go to double strokes on the sixteenths, you can get some nice easy 30 seconds, and it makes for good transitions, good dynamics, and good developments. So eighths to sixteenths, like we talked about in the note value section, just twice as fast. It'd be like this. So you remember how they're counted, eighth notes, just 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and sixteenths, 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a. And remember the eighth notes are inside the sixteenths on the 1 and, so you got the 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a. So that's how it's easy to make that transition from eighths to sixteenths being just twice as fast. So now I'll play it with a beat, and with just straight sixteenths on the snare, like this. You notice how I hit the crash on the 1 after the fill. That's a typical release of a fill, and we'll discuss that a bit later. For right now, if you feel that it's a little bit too uncomfortable, because you want to build on these stepping stones again, right? If you try going too fast, too quickly, you could miss some spots, and then you'll have to come back and rework them again. So what you need to do is, if the crash, hitting the crash on the 1 feels a little bit uncomfortable, do it without the crash. So it sounds like this. Now, when you do take it to the crash, what happens after the crash is you hit one hi-hat by itself, because that first hi-hat with the bass drum, you substitute it for the crash. So it's going to go crash, bass, hi-hat by itself, hi-hat, and snare. So I'll take just that section by itself slowly. So you see how it just crash, hi-hat by itself, hi-hat, snare. Again. When we start getting faster, sometimes that little extra note can get hidden. And sometimes when I do things really fast, I just don't hit it. I just come back on the snare. So, but for now, at the slower tempos, you want to make sure you get that extra hi-hat just before the snare. And now we're going to do it in a musical context. But what I'm going to do is, when I do the fill, I'm going to hit the crash on the 1, and then I'll have the hi-hat by itself. You'll be able to see it there. Here we go. On my next fill example, I'd like to show you just going straight around the kit, all 16ths, 4 on the snare, 4 on the first tom, 4 on the second tom, and 4 on the floor tom. So it'll sound like this. Now with a beat, it'll get this feel. Now to get the appropriate tempo change, going twice as fast, what I like to do when playing something like this, when I'm playing the beat, I'm actually thinking about the fill and the subdivisions already. It's kind of like how the fills, they foreshadow new sections coming up. Like if you're doing a straight eighth beat or groove for the verse and then the chorus is a triplet feel, you might have a fill in a triplet feel to foreshadow that new feel. So in that same respect, what I do is when I'm playing the beat, just straight eighths, I'll be thinking like while I'm playing just the straight beat. So I know exactly where the time's going to fall, and it makes it a lot easier to make sure that my timing is all together. So now let's do it in a musical context. Now on my next fill example, it's doing the same concept, but just 2 hits on each one. Now since if I only do 2 hits on each one, I'm only going to have 8 hits at the end. If I'm going to do a full bar of 16ths, like you said in the note value section, I'll need 16 of them. So what I'll do is I'll cycle it through twice for 1 full bar. That'll sound like this. And that's 1 full bar of 16ths. So with a beat, it'll sound like this. Now in a musical context, it'll feel like this.